524 on a Wednesday, coming off a Tuesday that, as expected, was a little cooler than Monday, and there weren't as many pop-up showers and storms. And this morning, we find the satellite and radar in a quieter place. For this afternoon, thunderstorms, especially to the north of the Virginia state line, have the best chance regionally to go severe. That boundary a little closer tomorrow. Want to alert you to a higher chance for thunderstorms, some of them locally heavy and gusty. We'll revisit that in the extended coming up. Here's a look out with your Bob King GMC First Alert Skycam from the Belleville Riverwalk, almost like that frosted glass look. It is hazy. It is very humid. Temperatures akin to that in the 70s to around 80. Headed for the lower and middle 90s today. Pretty deep into the 90s. Heat index values stressing you out, so hydrate early. The chance for a cooling and drenching storm lower today, Bill, than tomorrow. So again, we want to alert you to that and also extend your forecast to 10 days. Hot signals on the 4th. Back to you.